Chapter 366, Death of an Ecosystem. 3800000000 BC valleys, Marinerismas, the bacterium floated through the water in the deep ocean trench, looking for food. Food was starting to become pretty scarce, however. The atmosphere had been getting thinner and thinner over the past few 100 million years, and life had been forced to adapt in a hurry. Many species died, which only exacerbated the problem as dead species couldn't reproduce and feed their colleagues. It wasn't as if the atmosphere was empty, however. Meteors were crashing into what was left of the global ocean at an unusually brisk pace, which naturally made matters worse. Water was launched into the atmosphere by tremendous impacts and had a tendency to not come back down. The primitive life forms, fighting for their survival in a doomed biosphere, had no idea that 99.9999% of all life would be wiped out over the next billion years. The few life forms that were going to survive would be huddled deep underground near the equator, far beyond the reach of any future space probes from the solar system's other blue world. Fortunately for the bacterium, it was fairly robust. It had 3 nuclei and had evolved so that if one of them fell apart, another one could just take over. It had developed a fractal structure which would allow it to achieve as much surface area as possible for the same amount of protoplasm. Occasionally, bits and pieces of it would break off and join the detritus of the deep. One would have wondered why life would have evolved something so fragile which could fall apart so easily. It made sense, however. As long as the little cell was afloat, it had no weight to worry about. Losing pseudopods and cilia was also a quite useful defensive technique when the larger animals a few millimeters across felt like taking a bite out of it. The bacterium had not eaten for a long time, and it was starting to get very hungry. Usually it had been able to gorge itself on organic matter falling down from higher levels in the water column. However, 3 days ago powerful waves had made their way through the water column, a clear sign that something huge had impacted the surface nearby. Sure enough, the organic material which had been filtering down from above disappeared and was replaced by a steady rain of ash. Smoke and ash were not edible, and they had a disturbing tendency to kill things which were. The bacterium did not know, however, that there would not be that much food coming along any time soon. All it knew was that it was hungry, and it had to look for anything it could get its cilia on. A few days went by, and the ash fall continued with no end in sight. Not having enough weight to fall to the ground and possibly consume some of the rock down there, it found that it had no alternative but to try to eat some of its own cilia in a last-ditch effort to stave off starvation. The food kept it going for a few more hours as it continued to hunt for a more substantial meal. Suddenly, the bacterium caught a break. A heavy, dense ash particle fell right on top of one of the nuclei and started dragging it downwards towards the bottom of the rift. The organic material around the nuclei were fairly well protected, and the bacterium stayed in one piece as it landed on the bottom of the rift. The bottom of the rift tended to have a lot of organic material, and cells which had the good fortune to drift down there were able to eat a great deal. The bacterium stretched out with its cilia to try to eat the food in its vicinity, only to find that there was nothing in its immediate area. It tried to make its way down the rift, but found itself pinned to the rock by the ash particle. With no ability to leave its current location and no food in the vicinity, it had no way to feed itself. The end was nigh. As a last desperate measure, it consumed maybe 90% of its cilia, but even that was not enough. It tried to go after an extra nucleus, but found itself unable to reach the nucleus with the ash particle in the way and most of its cilia missing. Bereft of all sources of food, and with nothing left to hunt down more, it expired a few hours later. The ash continued to fall into the trench, and within a day the bacterium's intricate structure was perforated by little pieces of rock. One of the nuclei had been punctured, but the other 2 were still intact. The tiny microbe eventually vanished under the ash, never to be seen again 2600000000 BC. Ah. For the first time in 2 billion years, Mars was devoid of surface water. The last pockets of surface life, crammed into a small area by the receding water line, were all exposed to the air simultaneously. Several of the centimeter-long organisms promptly started panicking and eating each other, but that didn't last long before they dried out and died. Collapsing under weight they didn't know that they had. The animals' bodies fell on top of the rock, which had protected the bacterium for over 1 billion years. Time went by, and the animals slowly began to fossilize as minerals made it into their cellular structure. Fossilization was difficult, and only 2% of the corpses trapped in the rocks were able to fossilize. Nevertheless, that included 3 of the larger animals, and amazingly, the old bacterium 2,000,000,000 BC. The Martian atmosphere was just about gone now, and the surface was now completely devoid of life. Dust blew through the Rift Valley and covered the rocks filled with the bodies of dead bacteria and animals which had never existed on Earth. For the next 2 billion years, nothing happened as the ancient rocks were buffeted around by landslides and buried in the sand. Some of the fossils found themselves under 1,000 feet of sediment. Others, such as the rock with the bacterium and the 3 large animals, managed to stay on top September 20, 1996. Had there been any surface life forms left, they would have likely been astonished at the unusual sight. A large, unusually angular rock had fallen out of the sky and entered the rift. Usually, these rocks caught fire in the atmosphere and announced themselves with a streak of light. Most of these burned up in the atmosphere, and those which hit the ground tended to make a big mess. This rock, however, was different. It appeared to be made of metal, and it was rectangular in shape, with all 8 corners at right angles, most unnatural. What had even been more unusual had been the fact that there had been no streak of light announcing its arrival. It was as if it had just arrived in the rift by magic. What happened next had been even more amazing. The rock, which had buried itself in the ground a few feet away from the one containing the fossils of the 3-centimeter-long animals and the bacterium, suddenly shuddered. Was it alive? How could metal be alive? How had it survived all these years? The observers would have gasped in terror as the box-like animal opened its mouth, revealing a hollow interior. The box then charged, scooping up over 100 kilograms of rocks. The ancient rock with the 3 animals and the bacterium vanished into its mouth, and the observer would have wondered how an advanced organism like this one would have survived eating rocks. Less than a minute later, the visitor had finished eating. It closed its mouth, paused for a moment, and then vanished as abruptly as it had come. Valles Marineris was silent once again, with just the dust devils for company September 23, 1996. The 3 Martian animals and the bacterium were long dead. Had they still been alive, they would have likely been happy to find themselves weightless once again, just as they had been before the waters had receded. They would have likely been confused, however. How could one be weightless, yet not have water around to support you? And what had been that huge shove about 3 days ago, which seemed to have launched them into the air? Why was there nothing to eat in this area? And why was this animal not digesting them? The reason was obvious. The animal had already digested them as far as it was concerned. It had disproven the theory that animals, particularly large ones, could not be content with consuming rocks. The 4 fossils would have likely wondered where the animal's lair was, and whether its colony mates were going to be as merciful as it had been. They would have been correct in assuming that their eaters' colony mates would take care of them. However, any guess for the location of their eater's lair would have been off by over 100 million miles. Goddard Space Flight Center. Michael Amato spoke into his phone excitedly. You heard me right, Debbie. We just got an update from Linda Warren. The Portkey reached Valles Marineris 3 days ago and picked up some rocks. She doesn't know how many rocks it got, however. It's on its way back now. Cool. I need to tell Becky, Heather, and the rest of the MIT friends. Is the Portkey designed to host living organisms? I don't think so, Debbie. However, a corpse is better than nothing. What are the odds that there are going to be some fossils in there? No one knows for certain. I've heard probabilities ranging from 0.1% to 10%. Let's hope it makes it back. This is very exciting. Imagine a Mars sample return mission. When's it supposed to get back here? She's expecting between October 8 and 10 at this point. It's headed down to her house in Jacksonville. Not to NASA. I'm afraid not, as she launched it before joining NASA. However, she agreed that no one is going to be opening the box until it's in a safe quarantine area. Chapter 367, Night Flight to Venus. Tuesday, September 24, 1996, Goddard Space Flight Center near Washington. United States of America. Linda Warren looked at the crushed box which had once been a Portkey. She had tried to obtain a sample from an undersea vent about 2 kilometers down in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The Portkey had made it down there in one piece. Unfortunately, exposing it to almost 200 atmospheres of pressure had been a wee bit of a problem. It had come back leaking like a sieve, and about a third of the size it had started with. She nodded slowly. I figured that would happen. If we want to explore down there at some point, we're going to need to talk to the merpeople and have them do the same thing for us that they did for the party who visited the Hammer of Ra crater. Fortunately, the 1 kilometer test seems to have passed, and that's the important one. We have now demonstrated that a Portkey should be able to survive 90 atmospheres worth of pressure. The 2 boxes we have here are made out of stainless steel, which melts at 1636 K, still higher than the surface temperature. If we cast a spell around them to ensure that they're immune to acid, we may be able to get away with this. The NASA scientist scratched her head. Is your spell going to work under such extreme conditions of temperature and pressure? Linda shrugged. To be honest, I have absolutely no idea, and I don't want to put myself in a position to test it. However, I recommend that we try it. It can't hurt, and if we get lucky, it may actually work. The one which is going to come back with the rock sample isn't going to be on the ground for very long, and the one with the camera should survive long enough for it to send back a few pictures before the camera melts. If everything goes as planned, it should also make it back in time. The scientist looked over her shoulder at the second box, which had gone completely transparent. I must confess, I've never seen transparent steel before. That sounds like it would be a very useful invention. Linda chuckled. Standard transfiguration spell. Don't worry about it. Where do you want me to send them? Keep in mind that they have to go to a place which I can envision or at least see. The scientist thought for a moment, then grinned. You know, this could work to our advantage. We'll send both of them to the Venera 8 landing site to start with, as we have photographs from there. The one with the rocks will come back first, of course, as obtaining the Venusian rock samples should probably be top priority. Which reminds me, the Portkey will likely have to deal with the possibility of explosion as well as implosion. Explosion. Yes, explosion. Think about it. As soon as the door opens to let the rocks in, air at 90 atmospheres and high temperature enters the box. The box then starts flying back to Earth through vacuum. That's an awfully large pressure differential. That could be a big problem. Is there anything you can do about that? Linda's brow creased in a frown. You're right, of course. I hadn't thought of that. Well, I suppose I could cast the same pressure-resistant spell on both the inside and the outside of the box. Would that help? The scientist thought for a moment and nodded. That should work. However, we're going to have to be very careful in letting the air out once we get back here. One hole in the box, and the thing is going to go flying like a balloon with a rocket engine strapped to it. At any rate, back to the issue at hand. We'll send both of them to the Venera 8 site. The camera pans around inside the transparent box, which of course does not open. It then comes back and cools off a little. We then study the images and choose a location within sight of the first landing position. You then send the transparent box and the camera over there to check it out again and take more pictures. We then look for a place on the horizon there to explore and go there. Rinse and repeat. Linda's smile was vicious. Very clever. We jump in and out, in and out. I don't know if it's going to work, but we can definitely try it. It's going to take a long time, though. Linda looked at the scientist apologetically. I can't change the destination of the Portkey remotely. I have to be there, and although I trust my magic a lot, I'm not crazy enough to try to be the first woman on the surface of Venus. What this means is that we're going to have to go in and out, in and out. That's 2 weeks round trip each time. The scientist glanced at one of the TV monitors, which showed another group of scientists preparing the quarantine room for the incoming Mars rocks. Well, it's better than nothing. How long will it take you to prepare the inside of the box so that it will not explode when it starts the return journey? Linda shrugged. 10 minutes or so. It shouldn't be a problem. I'll do both of them, might as well. 15 minutes later, people all over the Goddard Space Flight Center began cursing that all of the lights had gone out and the computers had started emitting the odors of burned wiring. It took a long time for Linda to convince them that this sacrifice was worth the opportunity of the third Venus surface mission and the first one to return a rock sample Chicago Tribune newspaper. The Dresden Files. Tales from the Chicago Wizarding Institute column by Jim Butcher. This column is the first in a weekly series of articles reporting on the activities of the Chicago Wizarding Institute. My name is Jim Butcher, and I was chosen as the Muggle liaison for the CWI. My association with the CWI is, quite simply, accidental. While near my home in Independence, Missouri, many years ago, I stumbled across something which appeared to have been a piece of trash. I picked it up, planning to throw it out, when I suddenly found myself flying through the air at a high rate of speed. I had no idea that I had encountered a Portkey whose purpose was to transport the holder to the CWI. I had no idea where I was, of course. Keep in mind that this was before the statute of secrecy had fallen, so we had no idea that wizards existed. I figured I was in some kind of military facility and did what I could to see if I could get out without getting myself killed in the process. I learned very quickly that I had arrived in what appeared to be a secret magical base. I heard stories about several important people. CWI head Morgan Dresden, Aura Karina Murray, Aura Anna Lucio, and several others who will be mentioned in future updates of this column. These men and women risk their lives every day to prevent the rest of us from having to deal with monsters straight out of our nightmares. I soon came to realize that we owe facilities like this a great deal of gratitude, even though we weren't supposed to know that they even existed. Eventually, the wizards realized that I was not supposed to be there, and told me that they would have to kick me out and erase my memories in the process, what we now know as obliviation. Somehow, I managed to convince them to mangle my memories enough to allow me to publish what was left as a fictional fantasy novel in a way which not exposed the CWI. I returned home with my memories entirely modified and burning desire to write a series about a wizard detective in the Chicago area named Harry Dresden, the mangled version of Morgan Dresden. I was making good progress on the initial book, Storm Front, when the statute of secrecy fell and the CWI people who had obliviated me, whom I no longer knew, suddenly appeared in my house and apologized for their disruption of my memories. I received $100,000 in compensation and was allowed to become their liaison. I have spent the last few days reading up on the actual events behind what would have eventually been Storm Front. What I am about to tell you is all true. You can ask Wizard Dresden yourself if you wish. The first incident I will discuss starts with weather. If you have ever wondered why there have been strange storms from time to time, seemingly coming out of nowhere which catch the weathermen off guard, this story is for you. Wizard Dresden and Aura Murray were working on a case when a woman walked into their office and preliminary hearing for Carrillo v. American Department of Magic scheduled for 1/7. Reuters, according to a highly placed source speaking on condition of anonymity, the preliminary hearing for what is being billed as the Obliviation of America trial has been scheduled for January 7th, 1997, in a major court in San Antonio. The Teepster was excited about this development. It's about time that the wizards stop doing things behind our backs. We have the right to know what's going on, and we don't need some magicians to start modifying our memories. As of yesterday, 155 people have signed onto the class action lawsuit served by Carrillo. There will likely be more before the case goes to trial. Yom Kippur passes at Omega and in Jerusalem with few major incidents. Rhinebeck, New York highly modified Samuelist Yom Kippur services took place at the Omega Institute and in Jerusalem on Sunday night and Monday to observe the most important holiday in the Jewish calendar. As usual, the holiday focused on introspection and confession. The differences, however, were striking. At Omega, Deborah ruled that the traditional fast could be discarded if it interfered with a worshipper's ability to reflect and learn from the past year's mistakes. Samuel, who had run his own service in Jerusalem with the help of Rabbi Levine and the Cohen Gadol, seemed to have been taken aback by this for a moment, but eventually admitted that any form of asceticism would do. Most of the Jewish participants fasted, as did many of the Islamic ones. Many of the prayers were replaced with meditation sittings and mindfulness lessons, which seemed to be more Buddhist than Abrahamic. That should not have come as a surprise, however, given what has happened over the past month and a half at Omega. There were only two major hot-button issues. First, the choice of Deborah to lead the Kal Nidder service at Omega appeared to have troubled the more conservative members at Omega to the point where they had their own service. Recall that most of these clergy come from traditions where women were not ordained as priests or rabbis until Deborah began the custom with Mother Teresa. One can only hope that this does not split the conference and send Samuel's vision for world peace into the dustbin of history. The second issue involved a technicality with the Aes Sedai oaths sworn by wizards. The Kal Nidder prayer is actually a declaration that proactively renounces all vows between a person and the Almighty sworn over the next 12 months. This posed a problem with Jewish wizards who had wished to swear Aes Sedai oaths and were astonished to find that the oaths were not binding. Realizing that Aes Sedai violating their oaths would be a major blow to the acceptance of wizards, Deborah recommended that wizards who recited Kal Nidder reswear the Aes Sedai oaths as the form of promises to another person that he or she would obey the oaths. This form of oath is not eligible for renunciation during Kal Nidder, which in turn will make it binding on the oath taker. A spokesman for Britain for Humans admitted that he had been horrified to find that the Jewish Aes Sedai had not been able to swear their oaths. However, he was encouraged to hear that all of the wizards in question had acted as if they had sworn the oaths over the previous few months. The spokesman was hopeful that spellcasters who found themselves unable to swear binding oaths in this fashion would do so under the new protocol. Chapter 368, Mob Wizard. Wednesday, September 25, 1996. Siciliani Residenza Cantazaro, Calabria, Italy. Gerardo Siciliani had finally decided to take the plunge. He was going to get involved with the 'Ndrangheta criminal organization, hoping to avenge the death of his brother Uriel. As a member of the Italian Ministry of Magic, he had originally been tasked with the mission of keeping tabs on this particular criminal organization and make sure that they didn't start attacking people who were not already involved in the various Italian crime syndicates. He had done well at his job and knew a great deal about most of the group's leaders. His department, thankfully, had been quiet for a long time. The group's primary concern was the possible re-emergence of America and Britain for Humans, who had reportedly had talks about restarting the attacks given the obvious inability of the unbreakable vows to keep the wizards in check. They were too easy to circumvent. Half of the wizards in the hidden nations weren't even swearing them, and word had just come out that at least one major ethnic group hadn't been able to bind themselves to the vows for supposed religious reasons. Since the Britain for Humans truce was contingent on the wizards obeying the vows, this was a major problem. Everything had changed, however, when Uriel was found dead outside Uriel's house in the southern part of town. The shooter was quickly apprehended and determined to have been a member of Christians for Humans, the anti-wizarding hate group officially known as the Celestine Church. It would have ended there had it not been for the fact that the killer had immediately blurted he had been forced to commit this act by a member of Ndrangheta who had happened to have been a wizard. There was no evidence, of course, linking the shooter to Ndrangheta. However, Gerardo had always worried about the possibility that someone could leak his association with the Ministry of Magic to the various crime syndicates. Once that happened, it would only be a matter of time until Ndrangheta tried to get rid of him. He knew how to defend himself from Muggles. Unfortunately, it hadn't occurred to him to tell Uriel to keep his guard up. Now, unfortunately, it was too late. A few days after Uriel's death, a mysterious letter had appeared in his mailbox. The text was short and to the point. Don Gerardo, as you can see, Uriel is now dead. Your mother, Bruna, your wife, Emanuela, and your daughter, Camelia, are all being tracked by people with wizarding expertise. We are working on tracking down your cousins, even as I am writing this message. You have exactly 24 hours from the receipt of this message to stop monitoring our organization and resign from the ministry. If you do not do so, one of these women will be killed. Further relatives will die each day you delay. If you do not change your mind by the time we've run out of cousins, you yourself will be targeted by a high-ranking wizard in our organization. Do the right thing, Don Gerardo, and save your relatives. Gerardo had shuddered at this point. There had been unconfirmed reports of wizards in the organization, and many people in his office had spent the last few months looking frantically for proof either way and finding none. The letter continued. The Ndrangheta Syndicate acknowledges that your livelihood will be ruined if you are forced to resign from the Ministry of Magic. Your daughter, should she survive, still has to go college. Therefore, the Godfather has agreed to provide you a stipend of 20,000 euros per year to cover the expenses from your lost job. Gerardo had known immediately that it wouldn't be enough, considering his wife didn't work. There would be a catch, naturally, and he had suspected what it would be. He hadn't been disappointed. The Godfather apologizes that the organization cannot pay more than that. However, if you agree to join us after renouncing your affiliation with the ministry, we will be able to supplement the stipend with a 80,000 euros per year salary. The letter concluded with typical nonsense. May our Lord Jesus Christ grant you the wisdom to accept this generous offer. Your obedient servant, the Godfather. What a surprise, Gerardo had thought. Join our organization and we'll be able to send your kid to college. Your wife won't have to get a job at all, and you will likely have a very easy lifestyle. Of course, if you do anything to betray us, we will kill you. And if you don't do anything to betray us, the ministry will kill you. That letter had come yesterday morning, about 23 hours ago. He needed to think, and think quickly. There was an obvious solution, of course. The problem was that it was too obvious. He couldn't imagine someone in Ndrangheta not thinking about it. Nevertheless, it was the only thing he could do. He sent a patroness over to his boss's office. Don Amaranto, I need to talk to you. Amaranto, not surprisingly, responded immediately. I am always at your service, Gerardo. How can I help you? Simple. I take it you know about the letter I got sent by Ndrangheta. I do. I feel for you, Gerardo. What are you going to do? Gerardo drew a deep breath. I'm going to turn double agent. I'm going to tell them I'm going to work for them while sending information to you. Amaranto whistled. It's a clever idea, Gerardo. Unfortunately, it's too obvious. The Godfather has to figure that you're going to try it. I fully agree, Amaranto. Unfortunately, I don't think we have much of a choice. Rest assured, I will be very careful here. I know what to do. Do you know of any more information about whether they've got wizards? There have been a lot of disappearing wizards of late, and we're still trying to track down whether they're being killed or taken hostage by some of these groups. Not yet, Gerardo. Jesus Christ, can you hold on a second? We've got a report of a dead witch. I sure hope it's not what we think it is. Gerardo blanched, and he lost his concentration long enough for the patroness to nearly vanish. I hope so too, Amaranto, and I am praying. The delay stretched on interminably. Finally, Amaranto spoke once again. His voice was hoarse. We've just got an id on the body. Bruna Siciliani, age 69. Bullet hole in the head. I'm sorry, Gerardo. We'll do everything we can to help you and track down the killers. Gerardo nearly broke down. However, he steeled himself he could grieve later. That does it. I'm going in. I can't risk anyone else dying on my behalf. I'll keep you posted. Gerardo, wait a few minutes for your emotions to calm down. You're grieving right now, and... Gerardo cut him off. I can't, Amaranto. This cinches it. If I wait to calm down, they'll kill even more people. It's obvious they're not bluffing now. We have no choice. Rest assured that if it's a trap, I'm going to blast them into so many pieces that the devil will have trouble finding them. And if it's not a trap, I'll probably blast them anyway for killing my brother and mother. There was a pause on the other end. Finally, Amaranto sighed. I see your point. You're probably going to go in no matter what at this point, so it isn't worth fighting anymore. Good luck, and may God be with you. Location, classified Ndrangheta Syndicate safe house. Gerardo knew he was in trouble when the man who blindfolded him and handcuffed him greeted him with the word Expelliarmus. Son of a bitch, he thought. They do have wizards. He immediately tried to send a patroness, but of course couldn't because his wand was gone. Horrified, he tried to apparate out of there only to find it blocked. The man who had disarmed him spoke in a voice which was actually somewhat apologetic and sounded vaguely familiar. Don't fight it, Don Gerardo. You can't get out. You're trapped, like the rest of us. Gerardo didn't like the sound of this. Like the rest of us. What was going on? The wizard continued. Again, I apologize in advance, but I have no choice, as do you. You'll soon see why. Petrificus totalis. Gerardo's limbs froze as the wizard left the room momentarily. Seconds later, another man walked in. Good evening, Don Gerardo. I take it that you were unharmed on the way here. I speak for the Godfather, and rest assured I will punish anyone who overstepped their boundaries. Gerardo could barely speak. I am unharmed. I don't recognize your voice, sir. The speaker laughed. That is to be expected, Don Gerardo. I am disguising my voice thanks to one of my wizards. You see now, of course, that we have wizards in our group. You have undoubtedly tried to apparate out of here and found you could not. Gerardo couldn't nod, so he simply said, That is correct, sir. As I would suspect. You ministry people are very good at spells like that. Gerardo's jaw dropped. You ministry people. Suddenly, he recognized the first speaker's voice. Don Christian Padavano, Mother of God, you have turned. The first speaker nodded. Indeed, Gerardo, it is I, rest assured. The turning was not voluntary. I was trapped and had no choice, as do you now. Like it or not, you are now working for Ndrangheta. Gerardo was furious. I'm stronger than you are. I'll get both of us out of here. The spokesman for the Godfather laughed. I don't think so. Christian, would you be so good as to cast the spell that initiates the unbreakable vow? Gerardo couldn't see the various lights through the hood. However, he understood the incantation and felt the tingling sensation as the spell took him in its clutches. This was followed by something cold prodding him in the back of the head. Don Gerardo, the pressure you are feeling is a gun pointed at your back of your head. If you do not renounce your oaths, allow Christian to obliviate any plans you have, and follow all Ndrangheta commands within 1 minute, we will kill you and then promptly kill all of your relatives. You have already lost too, sir. Please do not put the blood of more innocents on your hands. Gerardo shook his head. I can't renounce my oaths. I am an accepted and have sworn an oath not to renounce oaths. The Godfather's representative chuckled again. I highly recommend that you do it, sir. You will feel a great deal of pain when you renounce the oath to not to renounce other oaths, which is the only one which will be problematic. However, it is far more pleasant than getting a bullet in your head. Pain is temporary, sir. Death is not. Gerardo swore. However, he knew what to do. He had to die for his country. He had always figured this could happen. Then it occurred to him that he couldn't. If he refused, his family would also be killed. God knows how far this would go. He knew one thing for certain, however. He knew why all of the Italian wizards had been disappearing now, and unless he was badly mistaken, he'd see them all again as a member of this organization. Christian sounded apologetic once more. I'm sorry, Gerardo. I can understand what you're going through. I thought the same thing, and it didn't work. Like I said, you're trapped. If it is any consolation, consider the fact that you are going to be given a generous salary for your work. Your family will also be helped out a great deal. Gerardo grunted. A salary won't go far if my own ministry comrades shoot me within a few weeks. The Godfather's representative laughed even louder. You will be able to enjoy it much longer than if you refuse and die on the spot. All you will have to do for us is follow our instructions and do what we tell you to do. Simple as that, and once you join, we will protect you from the ministry. Now you have approximately 15 seconds left. What is your decision? Gerardo stared at the floor in resignation. He knew what he had to do, and he didn't like it. But his family meant too much to him. Who knows, at some point in the future, someone could come in and free him from the group's clutches, at which point they would fall into the same trap he did. Come to think of it, the ministry could have easily sent him in at some point to try to get Christian out. The pain of renouncing the oaths was indeed excruciating, but temporary. Chapter 369, Magic Kingdom in Reality. Thursday, September 26, 1996, Magic Kingdom, Orlando, Florida, United States of America. Kenneth Franco chuckled when he saw the presentation. I was wondering when this would happen. Now that you've actually gotten yourselves access to wizards, you really want to make the Magic Kingdom. Well, a Magic Kingdom. The Disney executive nodded. That's right, Wizard Franco. First came the kids who started complaining that the little Mickey Mouse mascots and so forth were people in costumes and not walking mice. Then the adults started complaining that the older displays looked a bit cheesy and needed to be redesigned. It's only going to be a matter of time until people sue the Magic Kingdom for false advertising. How could it be false advertising? For Muggles, you've done a very good job. It's the closest thing to magic you've been able to produce. Indeed it has, sir. Unfortunately, you're American, and you know Americans. We want it all, and we want it big. Once they realized that the possibility of a theme park based on magic was actually available to them, they immediately started clamoring for it. Granted, a lot of the stuff they're asking for is probably impossible, but since when do Americans pay attention to real life? Franco nodded. I totally agree, Chairman. To be honest, I think our country is a wee bit too materialistic and TV-centered for its own good. Being able to reproduce things with magic may help a little, but it's only a matter of time until that just makes us even more greedy. However, back to the subject at hand. Judging from the presentations you've shown us, you'd be surprised at how much of the stuff we're going to be able to pull off. The executive gasped. Really, you can actually do lots of that stuff. Indeed, we can. Keep in mind that since Muggles can't see the entire realm of possibilities as we do, they can't get as creative as we can. At any rate, we'll start with the centerpiece attraction here in the Magic Kingdom. You want a floating palace. That's pretty straightforward. It's going to be a bitch to maintain, but it's doable. What about allowing the guests to fly up to the castle? That we can't do. We can't make people fly. However, what we can do is use the levicorpus spell to lift people up and then move them around in a way which makes them feel like they're flying. It's going to be awkward at first, but I suspect they'll manage to convince themselves that they've actually flown, especially if you attach wings to them. Can't you give them wings? In principle, yes. In practice, transfiguration of people against their will and without their knowledge is highly discouraged and in some cases is considered criminal. I don't want to start with that. Besides, the fact that the person has wings doesn't necessarily mean he'll be able to use them, or that they'll be powerful enough to provide enough lift to get him off the ground. I see. What about having real elves, fairies, and so forth running around here? That's questionable. They're sentient beings and so forth, and we can't compel them to do what we want. You'd have to hire them, pay them, house them, and so forth. Furthermore, keep in mind that the Muggle idealization of an elf or fairy is not necessarily going to match reality. Can you animate a Mickey Mouse doll? That should not be a problem, Chairman. Animating the doll and enlarging it to human size is a common magical technique. Keep in mind, though, that it will cause the employee currently inside the mascot to lose his or her job. Furthermore, the doll will still not be able to speak easily, and if someone from Japan tries to speak to the doll while it is being animated by an American wizard, you will have a language barrier. I thought you had language lozenges for that. We do, but each language has a different lozenge for it. You would have to guess which language is going to be used by each customer and have the wizard pop a lozenge at the right time. The executive jotted down some notes. I see. Can you handle parts of the Cinderella story, changing a child's clothes into a gown and so forth? That's doable. However, it will require consent from both the child and his or her guardian. That's going to add some paperwork, which will interfere with the illusion. The executive slapped the palm of his hand against his head. Illusions. I should have thought of that. Can wizards produce illusions? Including dynamic illusions, which can interact with the customers. Franco frowned. If two people view an illusion, they will see the same thing. Personalized interaction will be difficult. Well, forget that. How about sending passengers to the moon or stars? Franco shook his head fervently. The Selene lunar mission is the best we can do at this point. It will take 24 hours and still not allow the customer to travel outside the spacecraft without protection. As far as the stars go, don't even think about it. Even if we did beat the 24-hour barrier for the moon to the point where solar system travel would be easy, there is still no way we can exceed the speed of light. A round trip would take 9 years or more no matter what. The executive was about to start speaking once more when something suddenly occurred to Franco. You know, it just occurred to me that we may have an artifact available which will be a perfect fit for the new theme park. It's in England right now, and I'll have to ask Headmaster Dumbledore about it. Really, what is it? It's a magical mirror which allows the viewer to see his or her dreams coming true. The child will look into the mirror and see him in the best situation he can think of. It would be perfect for the new magic kingdom. It's called the Mirror of Erest. Can multiple people view this mirror at the same time? Yes, however, I recommend that people line up and pay for it so as to give themselves a personal experience. The executive grinned. That would be an excellent idea. See if you can get Dumbledore to let us have this mirror. In the meantime, let's switch over to the animal kingdom. What do you think about that? Franco shook his head in disbelief. We're going to have to tone this down a lot. I'd say 95% of those animals won't work. There's a reason Hagrid put the animals he chose in that zoo in DC. You may be able to get Deirdre over here, but she's a major draw there, and I doubt the new magical wing manager will part with her. But people love dragons. Indeed, and dragons love people as well, fried and possibly with ketchup. 169 South Street, Waltham. I was tempted, very tempted. However, I was concerned that it would be too cold and too crowded. I had looked into getting a hotel room in Rhinebeck, but found out very quickly that they had suddenly started selling for $200 night or more. Besides, I'd have to leave work early to get to New York before sundown, and I didn't think I could spare the time. Samuel's suggestion that people embark on a pilgrimage to a site important to them had thrown the Students for Samuel movement into a tizzy. With Rhinebeck a scant 5 hours from Boston and even less from New York, reports were coming in from Brandeis, MIT, and Harvard that no fewer than 250 people had decided to pool their resources and start heading over to Rhinebeck from those three schools alone. Samuel had declared the Omega Conference site off limits while the conference was in session. Unfortunately for him, he was stuck in Israel at the moment and had managed to overlook the fact that common people would find traveling hundreds of miles relatively easy. Once he had found out that Omega was going to be a major destination, he realistically had no choice but approve the visit. I suspected that Samuel would have his hands full in Israel. People all over Israel, and possibly the rest of the Abrahamic world, were likely going to fly into the temple for Sukkot and call it Samuel's personal pilgrimage. If Samuel had to okay Omega, he had to do so for the temple, as that was where the original pilgrimage had been. Mickle Oved was supposedly up to her neck trying to figure out where to put the predicted 3 million people about to show up on her doorstep. The biggest problem with the pilgrimage to Jerusalem was the fact that large numbers of people already lived in Jerusalem, and for the most part they weren't Samuelist. Even worse, many of them considered Samuelism to be a kind of heresy. Although Al-Qaeda and Hamas had been more or less disarmed, there were still flare-ups here and there between the Israelis and the Palestinians, which the former Hamas wizard and Mickle Oved clamped down on immediately. Jerusalem had been a powder keg, even without Samuel. Samuel's suggestion just added large, sprawling sucker cities with pilgrims from all over the world who were seen as heretics by many of the traditional Abrahamic faiths, and forced everyone to live in close proximity for 7 days. Not to mention the fact that many of my friends were still angry that the Western Wall had been demolished. Hopefully, the wizards would be able to take care of this before it turned into, a disaster of biblical proportions, and if they had Deborah lead the services at some point. I shuddered. Thankfully, I didn't need to worry about that. I was going to stay put, and hopefully the world wouldn't blow up over the next week and a half-icicle sidade Arctic Ocean. She didn't know where she was. All she could see was a cold white glow. She didn't feel any floor or wall. She was floating in a terrible empty nothingness. She didn't hear any voice. The silence was complete, and trying as she was to make any noise, she had no body. She had no sense of time, or magic, or self. Safia, cultist of the Black Guard, disciple of Rasputin, was unaware that her body, possessed and altered by the creature known as Mab since more than 2 weeks ago, was walking through a cavernous room filled with ice sculptures towards a magnificent ice throne. Her master, her god, even her own existence was fading away like a dream. In the real world, the white-clad woman reached the throne and sat down, closing her eyes. In the bright void surrounding the consciousness of the Russian witch, a pair of emerald eyes opened. Then another, and dozens more. One pair of them was bigger and somehow more clearly defined, less ethereal than the others. A cold voice came from it, like freezing wind through delicate crystals, and it echoed from the other eyes all around. Suddenly, forgotten or obliviated, she had no way to tell memories came to Safia about countless interrogations before, and by remembering, her surroundings instantly changed. Images flashed, too quick to fully comprehend, yet their meaning was crystal clear, as if they had already happened. Wizards and muggles fighting each other across prairies, in streets, in trenches, in grasslands, in frozen tundras, through deserts, on the sea, in the air, committing act of war that can occur upon this earth. These were images of war, a merciless, bloody a war so grand as to make hell itself tremble, a war whose fury is built with iron and lightning and fire, a war to sweep in like a tempest, leaving not even ravens to scavenge from this earth. And then the light of atomic explosions, followed by rolling mushroom clouds covering the skies, and years and decades of darkness and poisonous snow. Safia felt herself corporeal then, standing in a wasteland of ruins covered by snow. She looked around and recognized the gutted buildings as those of her hometown in southern Russia. As she took a step, she felt something crack under her feet and knew that it was bones, human bones under the snow. Slowly, she looked around. In place of the ethereal eyes, ghost-like figures surrounded her, every one of them constantly changing its form between two states, a bleached white woman with emerald eyes, and what was their original form. Humans, Vila, even fairies and a few giants. Beautiful daughters offered to the mighty queen in the north as tribute, would-be apprentices fooled by promises of power, formidable foes, or their beloved kin taken as trophies. And occasionally, devoted followers who actually volunteered for this. Their minds were open to her, pouring information even without legilimency on her part, even despite her occlumency barriers held in place. The witch spoke softly. "You are insane, all of you." The ethereal chorus snorted and spoke as one. "Did we just hear a follower of T. Chernobog questioning our sanity? Then let me ask you if your God would allow my madness to flourish across the globe." Mab paused, possibly savoring their next words, then continued. "Then wouldn't it seem to you that any God like that would be just as mad as we are?" Safia gritted his teeth and let out a low growl, almost sounding like an animal, and spat. "We will stop you." Mab ignored his reaction and continued. "We are Mab, the queen in the north, the queen of air and darkness and winter. Do you have any idea how many people your ancestors have sacrificed to me? How can you bow to a false god when you know that the one who your ancestors truly worshipped is real? How can you deny the millions knowingly thrown at our mercy? Napoleon, Hitler, it wasn't T. Chernobog that saved your people from them. It was winter. The millions carried away to die in the frozen lands of Siberia, they weren't sacrificed to the black god. Their soul is ours. How can you still underestimate our power?" The witch stomped defiantly, her will seeing to it that the bones, that one truly there under her feet, didn't snap. "You are in my mind, bitch. State your business if you insist, then get out, and no more of your games." Cruel laughter from around, and piercing stares from every eye. She recognized it as legilimency and concentrated on her barriers. Stone walls were cracked by freezing ice, but she quickly erected a steel wall in her mind's fortress. Yet she felt some fragments have slipped out, just like last time and before that. "Oh, but together we could be so much more," sighed the chorus, and it was impossible to tell if it was mocking or honest. "You are the first Muggle-born to be our mortal vessel in centuries. Look around, it's your mind that provided us with this beautiful vision of everlasting winter. Together we shall make it real." Predictably, the girl screamed, "Never." Mab just laughed. "I am in your blood, mortal. Your fate is sealed. Your body and life is no longer yours, and you will merge with us. The only thing you decide is how much you want it to hurt. There is no escape. But know this, mortal, I'll savor your defiance. It will make turning you all the more enjoyable." Chapter 370, Magical Big Dig. Thursday, September 26, 1996, City Hall, Boston, United States of America. Mayor Thomas Menino shook his head. "This is getting ridiculous," he mumbled. "They're raising the price tag again and saying it will take even longer. How hard is it to just dig a hole in the ground and get rid of the old one?" The advisor tried to explain. "Plenty, if you consider the fact that if we don't do this right, we'll wreck the entire city. Sure, we can dig a hole and finish it very quickly, but in order to do so, we would have to tell people they can't use I-93 for a few months. Do you want a reminder of what traffic was LKE here before they put the interstate in?" Nevertheless, I still can't believe that it's gotten so out of control. With my luck, the tunnels are going to collapse, and the one leading to the airport is going to flood because people used shoddy equipment in order to reduce the cost. That's not going to happen on my watch. We'll see that it doesn't, Mr. Mayor. In the meantime, all you have to do is sign here, and we'll get back to work. Menino looked out the window. You do realize we're in a bit of an economic downturn right now. How are we going to pay for all of this stuff? We can't raise tolls on the turnpike as people will scream. We can't put tolls on I-93 as people will scream even more. And I can't raise taxes without risking myself being kicked out of office. Whatever happened to the idea of civic responsibility? The advisor rolled his eyes. Mr. Mayor, don't dwell on the past. It's not like we can magically go back in time, and or can we? Menino shot a questioning glance at him. Frank, what are you suggesting? The advisor began laughing. We may have a solution after all, if one of them is actually smart enough to figure out how to do it. And I bet it's going to be a hell of a lot cheaper than Bechtel Parsons. Menino snorted. Oh, really? And what's that? You just wave a magic wand and everything gets built. The advisor's response floored him. That's exactly right, sir. We ask a wizard to do it. Menino's eyes widened. You want a wizard to bid on the big dig? Why not, Mr. Mayor? You've been to the 4 towns. They've got the ability to do stuff we can barely dream of and do it underwater. The fact that they even have a spell to keep the water out is going to help by itself. We won't have to worry about waterproofing a lot of the materials in the tunnel. Hell, we can have a big holiday downtown, and the wizard can just Evanesco the old elevated highway when it's time to demolish it. Menino whistled. You're serious, aren't you? Completely, Mr. Mayor. I suspect that hiring a few wizards at $1 million each will bring us a long way. There are only 3 problems, though. Oh, what's that? First, there may be people reluctant to use the tunnel if it's built by a wizard. If only 10% of the cars wind up on the city streets, downtown Boston is going to be gridlocked. Second, maintenance may be a little more expensive. We'll always need to have wizards around to fix things if there are problems. Finally, WSC won't be able to help us here because of the Cromwell case. The Cromwell case. Yes, a few people had their jobs replaced by one wizard, and one of the women sued. The courts ruled that the wizards should restrict themselves to doing stuff Muggles couldn't do and not taking Muggle jobs. Menino thought for a moment. You know, you may be onto something here. Judging from what I've heard so far about the Big Dig, it sounds like Muggles can't do that job here. They did the Ted Williams tunnel fine, sir. It's just the I-93 one which is problematic. All right, so they can get half the job done and only find much too late that they can't do the rest of it. Meanwhile, the price tag goes up and up. I can't believe I'm saying this, but I think we need to reopen the bidding process again, and this time have them include wizards. At the very least, that's going to hint that Bechtel Parsons be much more careful about keeping costs under control. The advisor nodded. I see where you're going. Bechtel Parsons is going to have a fit, but you can just say you've worked with them long enough and would be more than willing to keep them on if you had the money to pay for it. And now, since we're in a recession, we don't. Exactly. Let's issue a statement. We'll cap the bidding at $5 billion. At the very least, the bidder has to finish the central artery. If he can do that and still stay under budget, we can have them tack on the Green Line extension to Medford and Somerville, the North-South rail link, the I-695 belt, and a whole bunch of other goodies. Whatever they can get under $5 billion. The advisor goggled at him. You're going to revive the I-695 belt. People in places like Brookline and Somerville aren't going to be particularly happy when we kick them out to make room for a new highway. And don't forget Charlestown, whose residents will be helping choose the next mayor of Boston. Remember what happened with the West End and the Turnpike extension. Menino's response was to show the advisor a picture of a DeLorean aviator. Not if the cars fly, my friend. Not if the cars fly. Chapter 371. Woodstock at Al-Aqsa. Friday night, September 27, 1996, Al-Aqsa Mosque with Jerusalem. Mikkel Oved looked at the former Hamas wizard in disbelief. She turned to her colleagues in the Israeli Ministry of Magic and found her concern reflected in their faces as well. The Hamas wizard shrugged. Inshallah, everything will be all right. However, I must freely confess that although there are a lot of Samuelist pilgrims here, the majority of the inhabitants of Jerusalem are still members of the three traditional Abrahamic faiths, and they still tend to get on each other's nerves. Oved bit her lip. Unless they find a common enemy, which is precisely what I'm afraid of. The Hamas wizard nodded as he looked out at the scene stretching out before him. I agree, Madame Minister. You've got everyone in the ministry out there right now. Most of them, Wizard Amamos. We've got to keep some in reserve in case someone tries to do something stupid somewhere other than at the temple. Hopefully, that won't happen. Her colleague grunted. I sure hope not. However, remember we've got 8 days of this. There's plenty of time for something to go awry, particularly during the middle days. Besides, once Shemini Atzeret comes along, there's going to be a mad scramble for hotels. Once people realize these little huts of theirs aren't going to be particularly comfortable. Oved could not help but admit that the man was right, as she looked out from her vantage point, several hundred feet above the Temple Mount. Many of the Jewish wizards had argued that it would be disrespectful to position themselves above such an important shrine, particularly when the location of the Holy of Holies from the prior temples was still somewhat unknown. However, she was adamant, as the possibility of disaster was just too high. Spread out before her was a huge tent city which had sprung up over the past 48 hours. Although Samuel had agreed that worshippers would not have to go to Jerusalem for their pilgrimages, the prophet hadn't expected them to want to fly over there voluntarily. About 2/3 of the people had come in tents, RVs, and other unusual dwellings. About a quarter of the visitors had brought honest-to-goodness sukkot with them, the traditional box-like temporary houses which had been built on site. 1 out of every 12 people had come with barely a sleeping bag, and not much else. There had already been a few fights as people started fighting over who got the tents, who got the sukkot, and who got their RVs. Thankfully, it wasn't raining. Yet, if these fights were an omen, she hated to think what would happen if it started raining. The wizards, realizing all too well what would happen if the confrontations escalated into a religious war, broke things up immediately each time. Thankfully, though, the pilgrims had been quite well behaved for the most part. After all, they were almost all Samuelists, who were treating the gathering similar to the American concert at Woodstock. The big problems would involve how the religious extremists living in Jerusalem would react to the people whom they considered heretics. Many of the ultra-Orthodox Jews in the Meshirim district of Jerusalem had gotten into fights with several of their Samuelist brethren, excommunicating a few of the rabbis and reprimanding women who were not dressed modestly. To make matters worse, some radical Muslims had actually gone out and stoned a Samuelist passerby. Thankfully, the pilgrim had been healed quickly by the doctors, and the attacker had been placed in the custody of the Israeli police. Someone had nearly hit Celestine with a thrown citrus fruit, which was a traditional Sukkot ritual object, and had John Paul not put up a defensive shield around the Kohen Gadol, Suleiman would have likely gotten its partner, a stalk of palm with a very sharp tip, in the eye a few seconds later. There were already 11 people in jail, most of whom were pilgrims, and the holiday had barely started. It occurred to her that this must have been what Pontius Pilate had felt when he had to deal with similar pilgrimages during Passover, particularly with a popular religious maverick in town. Hopefully, these Samuelists would not meet the same fate as Jesus of Nazareth. The problems here, however, were nothing compared to what had supposedly been going in at Mecca. Many Muslim Samuelists figured that this would be a perfect time for them to perform their mandatory pilgrimage to Mecca. That made perfect sense, after all, as it was a shrine which meant a great deal to them. Unfortunately, many extremists there no longer considered the Samuelists true Muslims and had been meting out the traditional punishment for infidels desecrating Mecca: execution. Supposedly 150 people were already dead, and pilgrims were running for their lives. The situation had reached the point where Dagger himself, as a devout Muslim and the former Saudi Minister of Magic, was actually going to be intervening himself as a former Saudi and not a member of Atlantis. Oved knew enough about Dagger to realize that he was going to come down hard on the attackers, particularly one of his own country's holy shrines. Trying to put the problems in Mecca out of her mind, she watched as the people tried to make their way into the temple courtyard for the first service of the evening. People had supposedly been camped out for 10 hours outside the old mosque, as one of the advantages of carrying around a temporary house was the ability to set up shop wherever you wanted. She knew immediately that the wizards wouldn't be able to let even 1% of the pilgrims into the shrine. Many people began arguing for shrinking the pilgrims when they entered the mosque. However, the executive committee had vetoed that proposal, as some people would likely refuse to use magic in the temple on personal religious grounds, which in turn could result in them stepping on their pint-sized colleagues and killing them. The government had eventually decided to televise the ceremonies inside the temple and broadcast them on large closed-circuit screens outside the temple. The Jewish authorities had refused, of course, arguing that use of electricity was forbidden on the holiday. The broadcast was eventually handled by a religious Muslim who considered supporting the ceremony his charitable and moral duty. Oved looked at the wizards next to her once again. She sure hoped that this was going to work, and that Samuel wasn't going to try something stupid. Rabbi David Levine was barely able to make it into the mosque before the wizards and security officers barred the door and explained that they couldn't fit any more men into the building. The women's side was still filling up, but he suspected that it would also close up soon. Thanking God that he was 6'4", he looked up to the front of the mosque to see what was going on. Samuel was there, of course, along with his interpreter. He saw a few lulavim in the room, which was a bit unorthodox, as the palm stalks weren't generally used on Shabbat. He supposed that Samuel had figured the ceremonial plants were all right to carry on the Sabbath after all. He'd ruled that the shofar was okay. Celestine, John Paul, Suleiman, and the rest of the executive committee was there as well. Next to the executive committee was a huge pile of canned goods to be given to the poor. There was an even larger pile somewhere outside Jerusalem, he'd been told, as many of the pilgrims had brought food which violated the kosher or halal laws and as such were not appropriate for the temple. There had been a brief flap over genetically engineered crops, especially when Samuel didn't recognize the species, but Samuel had eventually let them in. Samuel looked resolute and excited. The interpreter, however, seemed a bit nervous. Even worse, so did the other executive committee members. Levine sure hoped Samuel was going to do something crazy again. He still had a problem with female clergy, but he supposed he'd get accustomed to it. Samuel raised his hand and began to speak. "Thank you for coming, ladies and gentlemen. For the first time in a long time, you will be able to celebrate a pilgrimage festival the way people did in my time and in the time of Rabbi Joshua of Nazareth, by going to Jerusalem, the center of the Abrahamic faiths. I have become accustomed to your world, and it is fitting that you can be introduced to mine at this point." There was scattered applause, as people couldn't tell whether they should clap or not. Meanwhile, Levine's jaw dropped when he realized who Rabbi Joshua of Nazareth was. Samuel chuckled. "At least we have a centralized temple now. When I was alive, they were still thinking about it. Dawid had some plans about it, but hadn't finished designing the building until after I died." Samuel's face grew serious, and the interpreter drew a deep breath when Samuel spoke once more. Before I begin the service tonight, I would like to introduce you to a new initiative which will help you understand our shared traditions better and with greater accuracy. I have read much of what you call the Old Testament, including a book which apparently was written by me. Samuel shrugged. I must say, this book of Samuel is very interesting reading. It would be even more interesting if most of the events in that book actually happened. I don't know who wrote this, but it's all wrong. I never said half of those things, and I certainly wouldn't have approved of ordaining Dawid king after I'd gone out of my to warn the people to not anoint a king, and Saul proved to be a disaster. My guess is Dawid wrote it, but I'm not sure. It sounded like my era's most powerful warlord apparently wanted to give himself additional supernatural support as a propaganda campaign, while he and his son were fleecing the populace to try to plan and or fund his temple to Yahweh. As if that, what do you call it now, trebuchet? He killed Goliath with hadn't been good enough to make him a temporary regional power. Levine stared at Samuel in shock. Samuel was thinking of changing the text of the Bible. That was going to raise a few eyebrows. The prophet continued, "There is a lot of information missing from this book. Tickwell isn't there. Someone left out the prophetess Nazareth, the powerful Philistine witch Ulatara, the Philistine/Nephilu alliance, as well as Michael Oved, and the whole ministry of magic. I can understand them leaving the witches out when the statue of secrecy was up, but we don't need to leave them out anymore. And of course, the story starts with that fable Eli thought up to explain how I came to be. After much discussion and debate, we have agreed to modify the text of this book to indicate what really happened. Since this is a fundamental text of your shared heritage, I expect that you will appreciate changes which I can promise to you are true. It will teach you more about my era, at the very least. For a fundamental cultural text like this, accuracy is crucial." The muttering in the crowd grew more intense. Samuel, sensing the problem, tried to explain his decision. "We already changed the story of the deluge to refer to Nohapishtin, which was a similar situation. This is for the best." Levine frowned. It actually wasn't the same, he thought. The Nohapishtin story was more or less kept the same. There had still been a flood and so forth, and the details had been changed somewhat. This, however, was much different. Entirely new characters would be added, Samuel's words would be changed, and so forth. David probably would get much more bad press, as would possibly Solomon if Samuel had known much about David's successor. He wondered how well this would go over with the non-Samuelist Abrahamics. Not well, he thought. Samuel continued, "Angier and Tickwell have offered to amend the latter parts of the Book of Warlords, which you know as the Book of Judges. They lived through that era and can help clarify some of those stories as well. I believe Tickwell already told you what really happened to Jephthah, Shimshon, and Goliath." Levine didn't know the true story. However, he'd heard that the students for Samuel in the room had received one hell of a surprise. Something about Jephthah having PTSD from the war, the Nephilim being real giants, and so forth. He looked at the rest of the executive committee and saw the expressions on their faces. It sounded like amending the text of Judges, and Samuel had been a very close vote. Most of them had realized that it was the right thing to do or had been badgered by Samuel, but were balking at what they would have to do to enforce the decree. Levine suddenly had a terrible vision of someone putting a bullet through Samuel's head and the whole movement collapsing in an instant. It hit him a few seconds later. How could one kill Samuel if Samuel was already dead? He hoped the man knew what he was doing. Chapter 372. Send Me an Angel. Sunday, September 29, 1996, Omega Instituter Heimbeck, and why Michael Sternberg couldn't help but laugh. For a convention which was supposed to be unifying the Abrahamic faiths, the people couldn't seem to make up their mind whether or not work was supposed to be forbidden. Officially, Samuel had decreed that the second day of Sukkot, which was a work-free holiday for people not raised in Israel, would be work-optional. The custom of focusing on the harvest and spending time in the sukkah would still be in force for all 7 days, however. A third of the Jewish pilgrims were of the people were following their prior traditions and not working today. Half had taken advantage of the fact that the second day happened to have been a Sunday and gone exploring. The remainder appeared to be really wanting to go on vacation with the explorers, but were a bit worried about defying tradition. Most of the Muslims had raided the cafeteria for halal food and promptly gone off on day trips. About a third of the Christians had stayed behind, figuring a work-optional day meant no work since it was a Sunday. The rest had joined the Jews and Muslims on vacation. The place was still jammed, however. With New York, Montreal, and Boston so close by, the population of Rhinebeck had exploded from the customary 7,000 to approximately 100,000. People were crammed into hotels, and Deborah had eventually found herself forced to admit the pilgrims onto Omega property. The overcrowding problem was alleviated somewhat by an enterprising witch, on a pilgrimage of her own, who started turning everyone's succor, tent, and whatnot into an extendatent. Suddenly, tents which could have slept 4 people could now sleep 80. But that didn't prevent virtually every park and field within 5 miles from being covered completely with tents. There were several shots of nuns, imams, and at least 3 Buddhist monks helping someone build a sukkah. The use of magic on the extendatants on the first day of Sukkot had been controversial. Some of the rabbis left at Omega had complained that use of magic was forbidden on the holiday, seeing it as a form of constructive work similar to building an extension onto the tent. The arguments intensified when Deborah had offered to rule on the issue. Many of the rabbis involved were still not accustomed to female rabbis. Deborah had eventually ruled that since the use of magic was not hard physical labor and did not require much creativity, just reuse of existing spells, it would be permitted. One of the rabbis naturally balked, at which point she had smiled sweetly at him and told everyone to sleep in his tent and kick out the host in favor of the guests if there wasn't any space. Considering that it had rained the previous day, that had settled the argument very quickly. For the most part, the first day of Sukkot had been quite inspirational. Everyone seemed to be getting along pretty well. He had once found himself chatting with an imam, a nun, and a young Orthodox rabbi or rabbinical student. He couldn't remember which, from Calgary named Seth Binnis, who had been curious about Omega and decided to check it out as a miniature second honeymoon. Normally, putting together an Orthodox man, an imam, a secular Jew, and a devout Christian would be a recipe for disaster. Fortunately, the meeting had helped all 4 parties learn more about their shared traditions. The pilgrimages had not all gone according to plan, however. There were rumors of chaos at Mecca, where radical Muslims had attacked Muslim Samuelists at the shrine, arguing that they were no longer Muslim and therefore not welcome there. Several hundred people had been killed, and non-Samuelist pilgrims on their Hajj had been found their quest for spiritual guidance turn into a nightmare. Rumor had it that Haydar Dagher, the Grand Mugwump himself, had led several Saudi Muslim wizards and Muggles into Mecca to deal with the attackers. Although he himself was an Aes Sedai, and therefore not allowed to create magical weapons or attack Muggles, he served as a negotiator while issuing battle orders through a Muggle, so he could get around the restriction of turning the wizards into magical weapons. The net result was that every single one of the attackers had been stunned, brought inside the shrine, and found themselves facing a furious religious leader who declared them infidels and ordered them led out of Mecca and then executed on the spot. It had been a neat reversal of the radicals' own plan. The biggest surprise, however, had been in Jerusalem. There had inevitably been several fights between the Samuelists, Muslims, Jews, and Christians forced to set up their little tents and Sukkot within walking distance of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Supposedly, the Kohen Gadol had nearly lost his eye to a thrown lulav. The real problems, however, had started when some idiot had thrown a rock at Samuel's interpreter after Samuel had announced his plan to modify the text of Samuel and Judges to base itself on Samuel's actual experiences. The rock had hit the interpreter in the head, and the man had crumpled to the ground. John Paul had immediately apparated himself and the injured man to safety, while a riot broke out as the Samuelists had tried to restrain the rock thrower. The man had eventually announced that he was a member of Christians for Humans and that more attacks would be on the way. Within 5 minutes, a good 100 people had been fighting and blood had been flowing freely. Enough policemen had been reluctant to shed blood in the temple for it to escalate long enough for it to spread into the pilgrims camped outside. The TV shows had been showing wide shots of masses of people fighting. That was when things had really gotten strange. No one knew exactly what it was, but they agreed on what they had seen. Apparently an angel with a flaming sword had flown out of the sky and had informed the crowd that God had chosen Samuel as his prophet, and as a result, the people should listen to Samuel. He then demanded that the man who started the fight step forward and face justice. Not surprisingly, all fighting had stopped immediately, and people started pointing at the rock thrower, who found himself unable to move due to the crowd in the temple. The angel had pointed his sword at the man's neck, told him that he would be in trouble for a long, long time, and then manually picked up the instigator and flown out of the temple with the man dangling from his hand. They had flown into a cloud bank and vanished. The services had resumed maybe 10 minutes later, at which point Samuel appeared to have gained many more converts. That had been Friday evening. This morning, Israeli newspapers had scoured television footage of the angel and concluded that his features did not match those of any of the wizards. Many people argued that it could have just been a transfigured wizard trying to calm everything down. Others, however, were fairly certain that an angel had actually visited them and provided proof that God actually existed. Las Vegas supposedly had already placed odds on this proposition. Right now, it was about 3. One that it was a wizard trying to stop the fighting, or an evangelical Samuelist wizard. And that's that. But no one knew for sure, and Pascal's wager had suddenly become a common water cooler topic. Realistically, though, did it even matter? Whatever it was, it had piqued the world's interest in the Samuelist sect, a sect which seemed much less radical and less prone to violent behavior than its parent religions. Most of the people here at Omega thought that God had actually spoken through the angel. At first glance, this didn't mesh very well with Deborah and Samuel's theory of a completely abstract God. However, Deborah explained that the two views weren't entirely contradictory. Perhaps God really existed, and he had created humanity knowing that their society would work best if they followed an abstract notion of a deity and not the deity himself. If this were the case, God would not have to reveal his existence, allowing the human race to have free will. It would also allow him more time to deal with pressing issues in the heavens and in Sheol. Sternberg made his way through the forest of tents and Sukkot over to the hill near the cafeteria, where a large communal tent had been constructed for the people to eat outside, as was the custom on this holiday. There were already complaints that the camp was running out of food, and most of the kosher restaurants in New York and Boston naturally weren't open today. The witch who had introduced the extendatants naturally offered to go to the 4 towns to see if they could help feed everyone. Realizing that there wasn't much of a choice, the Culinary Institute was overbooked. As it was, and half of the Jews weren't spending any money anyway, Deborah agreed to this. This promptly brought up an argument over whether magically produced food was kosher or halal, which Deborah promptly ruled that it was, and added that anyone who continued arguing with her would have to choose between excommunication or having his wife ordained as a rabbi or imam. Sternberg sat down to lunch. He was halfway through his vegetarian meal when someone asked him if he wanted to part of a panel. He turned to his interrogator, a Buddhist monk. A panel? Where? On what? Trying to make it so the secular and religious communities of all Abrahamic faiths can work together. You're a secular man, I've been told. We need to have a few secular people on the panel. Sternberg blinked for a moment, then shook his head. I'm not very familiar on religious matters, I'm afraid. I'm not sure I deserve this honor. On the contrary, Mr. Sternberg, that's exactly why we need you. Most of the world is secular, and we need to take the secular people in mind as well when we make laws and so forth. If we're trying to reunite the Abrahamic faiths, why can't we do something to stop the secular and religious worshippers from being at each other's throats? Sternberg thought for a moment, then grunted. Ha, I see your point. In that case, I'll be glad to accept. I must say, brother, how did you find out about me? The interrogator laughed. Sister Anne mentioned you about an hour ago when we were discussing what we've learned so far. You seem to be articulate. She's actually trying to get all 4 people from your group. They're the rabbi, you, her, and the imam. And that's just a start. The rabbi was actually born secular and found religion later in life, which is even better for this group. Sternberg's eyes widened. Could he be on the verge of something big here? Well, 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 he thought. Maybe God does work in mysterious ways. Chapter 373. Reverse Radioactive Decay. Monday, September 30, 1996, /17, Tishrei 5757, Sukkot, Day 3 / 5 days to Shemini Atzerethanson Experimental Physics, Laboratory Stanford University Palo Alto, California, United States of America graduate student Mary Soderberg nearly dropped the ingot of erbium on her foot when she heard the whooping of some of her colleagues in the lab. Spinning to see what was going on, she was startled to see a man in a strange robe, holding a box the size of a football festooned with lots of warning labels. She stared at the man in surprise. Who are you? What's going on here? The man introduced himself. I'm Wizard George Wilson, and I'm associated with the MT St. Helens Wizarding Facility. I've got a little present for you, and I've even got permission to make more of it for you. I've been told that your group is doing a big study on the properties of a group of chemical elements known as the lanthanide metals. Is that true? One of her co-workers nodded. It is, Wizard Wilson. The lanthanide metals can be found at the bottom of the periodic table, beginning with lanthanum and ending with lutetium. There are 15 of them in total, and we've got ourselves 14 of them, which is more than we can ask for. The wizard shrugged. So I've been told. Well, you've got 15 now. Mary gaped at the wizard. That's impossible. You can't get all 15. Promethium, element 61, doesn't occur naturally. The tiny amounts science has produced have come out of nuclear reactors. Wilson nodded. I'm aware of that. After all, that's where I got this sample from. The first colleague whistled. You've actually got promethium in that thing. Wilson shook the box. Yup. It's only about 10 grams or so, but it's going to be enough. The box is lead-lined, so it won't hurt you. However, I highly recommend that you put on radiation gear when you work with it, especially after I engorgio it, so you've got maybe 5 kilograms of the stuff. I figure you can actually do real experiments with it and figure out some of its properties. Mary shook her head. I thought you can't engorgio things anymore, Wizard Wilson. It's illegal. It's Geminio that's illegal, not engorgio. Besides, I've pulled some strings and managed to convince the people in charge that the benefit to science in this case is worth the risk of a citation. A second colleague frowned. That's dangerous. What if someone used this technique to get material for a dirty bomb? You don't need a radioactive element to be fissile to make a dirty bomb out of it. Another wizard walked into the room. You are correct, ma'am. That's why I'm here. I work for MT St. Helens and will be supervising the operation. I personally trust George here, but regulations are regulations. Now, I suppose you want to see what's in this box. If you do, I highly recommend putting on your radiation suits so you can get started. 45 minutes later, everyone was suited up. They walked into the clean room, and the wizard put the box on the experimentation table. All right, let's see what we've got in here. If anything good came out of the Voldemort disaster, It was the discovery that magic works in the presence of radioactive materials. All I can say is that I hope we don't blow your lights when I cast the spell. Mary looked on in excitement as the wizard cracked the seals, opened the box, and pulled out a glass vial with a small chunk of silvery metal in it. There wasn't much of it, of course. However, it was enough to send radiation alarms blaring through the room. Irritated, the wizard pointed his wand at one of the loudspeakers and shouted, "Silencio." The alarm turned off abruptly, as did all of the lights in the clean room. Wilson winced. "Oops, whoa, take a look at that." Mary gasped, as did virtually everyone else in the room, as their eyes immediately riveted to the one thing which was still emitting light. It was the small piece of metal, lit with a menacing green glow. The wizard grinned. "I can't see well here. I recommend that we make more of this stuff so we can see what we're doing right. Once we've enlarged the chunk of metal, we'll enlarge the lead box. Copy it with Geminio, no. Don't look at me like that, Sam. I know you're probably glaring at me right now, and put little chunks in each of the boxes so people can do multiple experiments with it. All right. Well, let's get a kilogram of this stuff and see what we can make with it." The wizard placed a lead sheet on a scale, weighed it by the light of a flashlight, and then poured the chunk of promethium out of the vial onto the lead sheet. The mass went up by 10 g. Wilson nodded. 10 grams, eh? Not for long, engorgio. The wand flashed, and the green chunk of metal suddenly expanded. Mary frowned. If this element had the same density as the other lanthanides, that sure didn't look like 5 kilograms. It looked more like 500 grams. The wizard beamed with pride. "There we whoa. How did that happen?" The wizard had gotten halfway through his sentence when the chunk of metal suddenly swelled once more, about 3 seconds after he had cast the spell. Now it looked like it was up to 580 grams. The wizard frowned. "This doesn't make sense. I only cast Engorgio on it once. Why would it expand twice, Sam?" Mary saw the other wizard try to scratch his head and fail due to the radiation shielding. "To be honest, George, I don't know. I've never seen this happen before. How much do we have now?" There was enough light to see the scale clearly now. About 580 grams. Well, I wanted 5 kilograms, but this is more than enough. All right now, let's start bringing over those lead boxes and putting samples of this in each. 10 minutes later, with 3 boxes filled, the sample suddenly grew again. Wilson now sounded uneasy. "This is not right, Sam. We've just gone up another 100 grams. We're at 680 total now. Did you do anything?" The other wizard also sounded troubled. "No, it wasn't me. Hold on a second. Revelio hominum." Mary shivered as the spell detected her. Seconds later, the second wizard shook visibly. "There's no one else here, and I highly doubt any of these people are wizards. Otherwise, they wouldn't have needed us. Besides, none of them is carrying a wand. Something damn peculiar is going on here. I think we'd better check out your wand back at base, once we're done packing all this up." Wilson nodded. "I agree. Let's get out of here before I do something else weird." They resumed packing the boxes. It took them another hour and a half to package the rest of the radioactive element. The clump had spontaneously grown to about 1.03 kg a few minutes later. I wasn't even pointing my wand at it. Followed by another jump to about 1.4 kg. Eventually, it seemed to stabilize at about 1.6 kg. Everyone could feel the heat emitted by the radiation. With all the promethium finally packed up, they closed up the clean room, thanked the wizards, and left the clean room to call the facilities department so they could fix the lights in the clean room. 3 hours later, after the radiation-suited team had begun running their experiments, the facilities manager tapped Mary on the shoulder and chuckled. "You don't need us to change the light for you, my friend. Looks like someone left some kryptonite on that scale there. I'd say we've got a good half-pound of that stuff in there." Mary snorted. "Kryptonite. What else could it be, ma'am? I can't think of anything else that's green and glows." Mary gaped at the man in horror and told him to down some potassium iodide pills and see the doctor. She glanced through the peephole into the room, thankfully. The door had closed on its own, and saw that the chunk of radioactive metal had reappeared. She rounded on him. "Don't go in there until I tell you. It's dangerous. Hold off on changing the lights for a while." The facilities man stared at her. "What?" "Don't talk. Go to the doctor. Now." Radioactive Isotope Physics Laboratory Riken Research Institute is Japan. Sachiho Hajiwara blinked. The 16-gram block of promethium she had been working with had suddenly vanished in the blink of an eye. Sure, she knew that the stuff was radioactive and that it would eventually disappear in about 18 years or so, but it couldn't disappear all at once. The probability that 6*1022 atoms suddenly decided to decay at the same time was as close to zero to even be considered. And even had they all decayed, they would have decayed into another of the lanthanide metals. Cursing, she looked around in her radiation suit to see if it had fallen into a pocket. She doubted it had, and a good 5-minute investigation revealed nothing. Frantic, she reached for her Geiger counter. The walls of the lab were lead-lined, so no extraneous radioactive sources could interfere with the experiments. Any radioactivity detected by the Geiger counters would have to come from inside the room. Convinced that this would help her find her missing piece of promethium, she turned on the Geiger counter. Hajiwara couldn't believe this. She had to be hallucinating. Maybe she had gotten too much radioactivity somewhere along the line. She couldn't see how, however. Hoping that she wouldn't have to explain how that sample of radioactive material just disappeared on her, she left the lab, changed out of her radiation suit, and headed down to the doctor to see if she had picked up any radiation poisoning. The doctor looked her over for a good 20 minutes and concluded that she had not. She seemed perfectly healthy. Something very fishy was going on here. Chapter 374, Sykes Family Reunion. Tuesday, October 1, 1996/18 Tishrei 5757 Sukkot Day 4 days to Shemini Atzeret Pekanik Bay Skilled Nursing Facility Riverhead. United States of America. Edward Morton felt pretty good today. His legs weren't aching all that much, and the food had actually been somewhat good. Then again, his hernia was acting up again, and his granddaughter had just gotten a C in one of her courses in college. His daughter-in-law had naturally been furious. He was fairly certain, however, that she would soon learn the discipline to stick to her studies. After all, she was in Navy Rock. Edward couldn't get over the fact that they were allowing women in the service now. He was from a family with a long tradition of soldiery. He had fought on the beaches of D-Day on the Second World War, and his son had served in Vietnam. His father had been gassed in the First World War on the Western Front, and his great-grandfather, Bartholomew Sykes, had been in one of the New York militias during the Civil War. War was never pretty, but it was a family tradition, and someone needed to make sure that the country was safe. Judging from the horrors his father had told him about from the trenches in the First World War, he had thought that he had prepared himself for everything. And he had been, until that day in April 1945, when he had been part of the unit which had liberated Buchenwald. The sights he witnessed in that camp had scarred him for the rest of his life. It occurred to him that he shouldn't be complaining about the nursing home food when he had seen people getting barely any food at all. He had spent months denying that he needed a nursing home. However, time waited for no one, and he had just turned 83. He had gotten pretty weak over the past few years and was starting to have trouble walking. Eventually, he gave in when both Danny and Rachel threatened to stop bringing the grandchildren to his old house. There was a knock on the door. Turning off the television, which was still going over the bizarre events in Jerusalem, the odds that a wizard had been involved were now up to 8. 1 in favor. There were reports that a wizard had disappeared from the area shortly before the incident. He told the doctors to come in. He wasn't sure why the doctors would be seeing him at this time. It was somewhat off their normal schedule. The door opened, and the doctor entered, followed by a man in suit. "Good morning, Edward. How are you doing today?" Edward shrugged. "Pretty good, I guess. What brings you over to my neck of the woods this time of day?" "You have a visitor. He claims to be a wizard." Edward let out a big belly laugh. "A wizard wants to visit me. What for? I'm not a wizard. Or at least I don't think I am." The suited man smiled. "You're not a wizard, Mr. Morton. I'm Wizard Joseph Hugely from the Department of Mysteries in Prescott, Ma, so I should now. There's something we need to talk to you about which you may find very interesting. Are you healthy enough to travel?" The doctor spun in surprise. "You're taking him on a trip. He can't walk all that well, and I doubt he's in good enough position to apparate." "Don't worry. I've got a wheelchair and will be taking care of him." The doctor shook her head. "I'm not sure if wizard support is covered by the policies. I think I'll have to send someone with him." Hugely looked at her sharply. "That is out of the question, I'm afraid. The information I need to discuss with Mr. Morton is top secret level classified. In fact, he will have to be obliviated after the meeting concludes." Edward stared at the wizard, confused. "Wizard Hugely, I can keep a secret. I was a soldier after all. Besides, aren't you fellows out now?" Hugely nodded. "This information is classified even for most wizards. I'd say 99% of the wizards don't even know that this project exists. The Department of Mysteries is off limits to most people." Edward's confusion deepened further. "Then what do you want me for? I've never been involved with wizard projects." "Well, you are now. If you're up to it, I'll bring the wheelchair and we'll get going." "Where are we going, Wizard Hugely?" "I can't tell you here, Mr. Morton. However, if it helps you feel any better, most of your relatives are coming as well. Daniel, Rachel, and Barry have already reached your destination. 3 of your grandchildren, Noel, Amanda, and Caitlin, are also coming. There will also be second and third cousins you've probably never met. Trust me, Mr. Morton, you want to come. They're all waiting for you and Caitlin, since we're concerned about having either of you apparate." Edward stared at the wizard hard. "What's wrong with having Caitlin apparate? She's 26 and she's my eldest. She's a tough girl." The wizard shrugged. "She's pregnant. Pregnant women shouldn't apparate." The doctor looked at Edward and then at the wizard. It was obvious that he was going to go no matter what. "All right, Wizard Hugely. I'll go get the wheelchair. Make sure he comes back in one piece." The wizard nodded. "You have my word on it, Doctor." The wizard wheeled Edward to an unmarked car and helped him in. "We normally would just fly you there, Mr. Morton. However, due to the high secrecy here, we don't want too many people to find out that you've gone away with us. The doctors are already sworn to secrecy, and we can trust them." They drove down I-495 for half an hour, got off at the exit for Brookhaven National Lab, and drove around the lab for a while. Eventually, they stopped in front of a large rug lying on the ground. Edward whistled. "Is that a flying carpet?" "It sure is, thank you, Guinevere. We've beefed it up so it can travel 60 mph. We'll be at the ministry in a couple of hours." The wizard lay Edward down on the carpet and then handed him a sealed piece of parchment with instructions not to open it until he was airborne. After spending a few minutes putting away the wheelchair, he moved to the front of the rug and put himself into position for takeoff. Hugely called back over his shoulder. "All right, Mr. Morton. Before we begin, I want to confirm your identity. You are indeed Edward Bartholomew Morton, age 83, of Riverhead." "What was your mother's name?" "And her maiden name?" "What were Sarah Sykes's grandfather's names?" "Hold on a second. My memory isn't as good as once was. Ebenezer Mackenzie and Bartholomew Sykes." Hugely nodded and launched the carpet into the air. "You are indeed the person we're looking for. Go ahead and open the document now." Fumbling with his arthritic fingers, it took him a while to open the document. There were lots of official-looking seals on it, and reports that anyone who wasn't supposed to read it would be hit with nasty curses. Fortunately, it seemed to like him. He read a little further down it and came across a dynamic photograph of an archway of some sort with a gauzy black curtain strung across it. Underneath it were the words, Deathgate Project, Top Secret. Edward hissed and turned to Hugely. What the hell is this? Deathgate Project. Are you going to kill me? Is this the way people die? Hugely laughed and shook his head. No, Mr. Morton. Keep on reading, and you may find several of your questions answered. Skeptical, Edward read on. His eyes widened when he saw reports that the Deathgate allowed the people to talk to the dead. His jaw nearly fell to the floor when the report mentioned interview with and requests of Civil War veteran Bartholomew Sykes. He read the next few lines and began trembling in fear and anticipation. Are you telling me that my great-grandfather wants to meet his descendants? That's right, Mr. Morton. Virtually everyone is going to be there. The room is going to be pretty cramped, but we're sure we'll have room for the wheelchair and Wizard Durant, the man who will be operating the flying carpet heading into Sheol. He can't go in, obviously, but he'll be able to tell the machine what to do. It's an unmanned probe, just like with NASA. Death Chamber Department of Mysteries. The death gate, with the iris still closed, had been mounted on the wall at least 4 feet up to make sure no one would accidentally walk into it. The flying carpet with the probe was lying on the floor next to it, near a large TV screen. The rest of the room was occupied by row after row of chairs. Edward couldn't believe half of the stuff he had seen in these halls. He'd have loved to tell the world about this. Unfortunately, the wizards had confiscated all writing tools and electronic devices, knowing the Obliviation would take care of the rest. They really didn't want word of what was in the Department of Mysteries leaking out. Considering what had happened with the Statute of Secrecy, that was probably a very good idea. They wheeled him over to the front of the room as the other people began to file in. Apparently he had relatives he didn't know about, many second cousins. There were at least 6 second cousins, 14 people who were his children's third cousins, and 27 college-age students. There were even 7 infants lying in their carrying cases. All of these people were descendants of Bartholomew Sykes. Although most of them lived in the New York area, there were some from as far away as St. Louis and Miami. A few of them had moved out of the country to get married. His great-grandfather would likely have been astonished to find that he had a couple of Chinese great-great-great-great-grandchildren. It was 4 greats, right? There were investment bankers, doctors, and teachers. There were also a few janitors, construction workers, and painters. There were also a lot of soldiers and ex-soldiers. Edward was astonished to find that no fewer than 3 of his second cousins had served in the Second World War. One of them had apparently been a fighter pilot, another an infantryman, and another a midshipman who'd barely managed to get out of Pearl Harbor alive. Everyone was silent, including the babies, as the wizards explained what was going to happen. There were very few questions, and minutes later the door to the death gate opened and the flying carpet with the probe made its way through. All eyes turned to the television screen. Sheol. Bartholomew Sykes was thunderstruck. He had been amazed to learn that the wizards had figured out how to transmit images in and out of Sheol. Now, he would be able to see out of the death gate as easily as they would be able to see in. The probe apparently had been equipped with a mirror which reflected images from inside the Ministry of Magic onto the flying carpet, which was made of a smooth white material. The images were upside down and all reflected, but he could always float around to make sure they were in the right orientation. The ability to see out of the gate was nothing, however, compared to what the content of the first pictures which came through the gate. They showed a room with Hugely, Durant, and no fewer than 65 other people. They ranged from a white-haired man in a wheelchair to several tiny infants. Some of them didn't look American, but he figured that was his bad eyesight acting up again. Were these all his descendants? They didn't even look like him for the most part. This was impossible. Then again, there were wizards involved here, so who knew? Hugely spoke first. Mr. Sykes, here they are. These people are all your descendants, and they're very interested in hearing from you. There are people from 4 generations here, my friend. Those little bundles of joy are your great-great-great-great-grandchildren." Sykes couldn't help but cry. I can't believe it. 65. Thank our Lord Jesus Christ. He has been so merciful." "Indeed, he has. On other extreme, I believe you'll find someone you recognize, or at least saw evidence of. You mentioned that your eldest granddaughter, Sarah Sykes, had gotten married a few years before you died." Sykes nodded. "I believe so. She was pregnant with her first child when I died. I had always hoped that I would live to see that great-grandchild, but that was not to be." Hugely chuckled and put his hand on the wheelchair. "Well, you can cross that off your list. Last time you saw this man, he was in Sarah's belly. He was born maybe 4 months after you died. Mr. Sykes, allow me to introduce Edward Bartholomew Morton, son of Sarah Sykes and Asa Morton. And unless I'm badly mistaken, he was given his middle name in your honor." Chapter 375. Final Preparations. Tuesday, October 1, 1996/18 Tishrei 5757/Sukkot Day 4/4 days to Shemini Atzeret 1400 Suffolk Downs Racetrack Boston. United States of America wizard Jeff Rinaldi looked over the racetrack. It was more or less empty, but that suited him just fine. The closer he got to the finish line, the more likely it was that this was going to work. He had looked up the new rules carefully and was fairly certain this wasn't covered. They said that he was not allowed to bring Felix Felicis to casinos or any other places where gambling took place, and they said he wasn't allowed to use anything to change the odds at sporting events. The directive included a list of major sporting events, and it was pretty comprehensive. Well, almost comprehensive. For some reason, they hadn't included horse racing. Maybe they figured that it wasn't popular anymore among the Muggles. It certainly was less popular than football and baseball, and it had certainly gone out of fashion with the Wizards a long time ago. He didn't care why the Wizards had not mentioned it. The important fact was that it wasn't there. He looked at his racing card for the first race of the day. Miss Ellie was the favorite at 1 odds, and she was in position 1. Beauty Queen, horse 2, was at 12-1. Then came Ladybug, 16-1, Pearl, 7-1, Hula Skirt, 18-1, and Merryweather, 10-1. There were 6 horses, many of which would pay him handsomely. This race was going to be easy. All he had to do was place bets on the 4 horses with the worst odds. Judging from his vantage point, he believed he had enough time to hex 2 horses while they were coming down the backstretch. The only problem he could think of was the fact that if 2 horses were neck and neck, he could miss and hit his own horse by mistake. There was only one way to find out, though. He headed over to the betting kiosk and bet $10 on each horse other than the 7, 1 and 1. Satisfied, he went back down to his seat and watched as the race unfolded. The favorite, not surprisingly, shot out to a large lead. The 16, one was in second, 7 or 8 lengths back. Rinaldi hadn't thought he'd have to use the spell so early on in the race. However, he had no choice. Having the horse suddenly stop, running 2 feet from the finish line, would be much too suspicious. Grateful that the Deceleratus hex didn't have a visible beam, he brought out his Fideliest wand and pointed it at the pack. He fired it off, hoping that he would hit the horse in the lead. Nothing happened. The favorite maintained her 8-length lead. Frantic, he tried again. Nothing. He was about to shoot a 3rd time when he saw some commotion in the stands on the far side of the track. Apparently one of the vendors was having trouble walking. No, he was just walking very slowly. It occurred to him that not only had he missed on the first spell, he'd hit the vendor. He had to be very careful. The horses came around the final turn, and the favorite still had a large lead. He had to do something, however, and do it quickly. Hoping there was still enough time to slow Miss Ellie down, he fired the beam again. He figured the horses would be easier targets this time, as they were closing in and running almost at him. They wouldn't be swerving left or right as often. Bingo! The lead horse suddenly slowed down by maybe 1 mile per hour or so, exactly what Deceleratus Minimus was supposed to do. The track announcer reported that Miss Ellie was losing steam and the 16-1 was starting to make up ground. The 8-1 was coming up alongside her, and it looked like it was going to be a 3-horse finish. Rinaldi didn't care anymore, however. He had both the 8-1 and the 16-1. As long as one of them won, he'd come out ahead. The 8-1 nipped the favorite at the last minute, causing a good half of the people in the stands to salute the victorious underdog. The man next to him swore bitterly that he had lost $250 on the favorite. Rinaldi grinned. One race in, and he'd won $40. He figured he should probably not tamper with a few of the next ones as to avoid suspicion. Yes, he would lose most of the time, but a slow loss of $10 followed by a lucky win of $100 would make it seem much less suspicious. He sat back down and waited for the next race to begin. 1430 Jogsmead. Darina Vovchenkaya looked at the letter Halina Zyganova had dropped off earlier today, during lunch. The Amelia Bell imposter had excused herself during lunch, wandered outside Hogwarts, hidden herself in some trees outside the apparition boundary, put on her invisibility cloak, and apparated home. Slowly, Vovchenkaya turned to Zyganov and saw that he was also trembling in excitement. "Get ready, Mr. Zyganov. It's going to be tonight. We're going to have that wand in no time, and Rasputin is going to be very happy with us." Zyganov nodded. "Indeed. I'm still not entirely sure why he wants Dumbledore's wand, though. Maybe as proof that we've done the deed. Perhaps. We know Dumbledore is a powerful wizard, after all. He could cause complications when Rasputin takes over." Zyganov looked out the window. "I hope Halina's going to be all right. I hear she's pretty well liked there, and I can't imagine them suspecting her, particularly if we shoot off the dark mark there at the end." "I sure hope so. It's been a pleasure working with you too." Zyganov had been spending most of his time hanging out around Muggles, invisible. Of course, he had the invisibility cloak most of the time, to gather information to relay to his wife about Muggle customs. Vovchenkaya had helped as well during the day, but was forced to stop working in the evenings when she had to go back to Belle's apartment to prevent her roommates from noticing her absence. They had put a lot of work into this assassination plan, and it was finally time to carry it out. Taking the invisibility cloak from Zyganov, Vovchenkaya headed back to Belle's apartment to leave a note that she would be back late. She had to stay under the cloak, of course, because people would have wondered what Belle was doing out of school during class. Pocketing the invisibility cloak, she would be needing it for a few hours. She returned to the Zyganovs' rented house to get their hands on the tool of the hour, a Muggle pistol. Rasputin had been adamant that a Muggle weapon be used to do the deed, and that the evidence be disposed of immediately as to not incriminate the new Muggle on the staff. Taking one last look around the house, she closed the door, never to return. The plan was to have Zyganova tell Dumbledore that a student had told her that several Death Eater masks had been found in the Forbidden Forest. Although no one had actually seen the Voldemort supporters, Dumbledore couldn't risk the Death Eater movement starting up again under a new leader. This would likely force wizards to come out and force to confront the Death Eaters. Dumbledore would almost certainly join the hunting party, and if he brought anyone with him, Zyganova would recommend that the group split up and try to find evidence of the group's whereabouts. He would likely tell Zyganova as the Muggle to stay inside, which she would do to maintain her alibi. The wizards would leave the castle and head towards the Forbidden Forest. Vovchenkaya, hidden in the trees under the invisibility cloak, would wait until the group split up and then follow Dumbledore. Once he was alone, she'd shoot him. There were several risks, but there wasn't much they could do about it. The biggest one was Dumbledore seeing them before he died. Once that happened, the game was up, as he would just tell everyone when his portrait went up in the headmaster's office. The second was the possibility that people would pair up to watch each other's backs. If that happened, Vavchinkaya would be forced to kill both Dumbledore and the witness and clean everything up before anyone got there. Once everything was cleaned up, she would escape via Portkey. The third possibility, and most worrisome, involved Alastair Moody. It was almost certain that the defense against the dark arts teacher would be in the posse. Moody was dangerous in that his magical eye could see through invisibility cloaks. If Moody caught a strange woman hiding in the trees before the hunt began, they'd suspect her immediately. Vavchinkaya couldn't even use the Amelia Bell Polyjuice potion as an option because Muggles weren't supposed to have access to invisibility cloaks. There were all too many ways this could fail. Then again, failing Rasputin would likely be a hell of a lot worse. Reciting a brief prayer for success, she put on the invisibility cloak, took the portkey and the gun, and started towards Hogwarts. Thank God the Silencio spell worked much better than a Muggle silencer.